Hello and welcome to NDTV. I'm Aditya Kaul and we are coming to you from the NDTV World Summit. Over the last few years, we've had several speakers all across the globe speak about India's rise and the diplomatic prowess. But there's been one speaker, the former Prime Minister of Australia, Tony Abbott, whose quote that 21st century is the India century has been making rounds. I've asked him this before and I'll ask him again. Thank you very much, Prime Minister, for coming here. I want to begin by asking you again, why do you say this again and again, that India is the main country all across the globe for the 21st century? And you also say that India is that democratic superpower that the world watches.
Because I think India has in its DNA what it takes to succeed in the modern world. India has thoroughly assimilated democracy. It's thoroughly assimilated the rule of law and justice according to law. And to a great extent, India speaks the world's common language, which is English. I think these are priceless advantages which, for argument's sake, China definitely lacks. China is a totalitarian state. I think it's very difficult to sustain creativity in a totalitarian state. I don't deny the strength of Chinese culture. I don't deny the decency of the Chinese people, but they've got a rotten system. India's got a good system, and under a good system, people are free to be their best selves. That's why I think the 21st century is more likely to be an Indian century than a Chinese one, and I certainly think it would be better for the wider world if it turns out to be an Indian century, given that India is, as I say, a benign and democratic superpower.
Well, Mr. Abbott, I have a question on China. But first, when we speak about India today, we have to speak about Prime Minister Modi as well. And 11 years ago, inside the MCG and Canberra, I was there, as were you and the Prime Minister. And that was one of the first massive receptions from the diaspora received by the Prime Minister. And it's been 11 years. How do you see Prime Minister Modi taking India's foreign policy to a new success? You saw the G20 that happened 2 years ago, the consensus that emerged. And today, while there are tariffs on India, while there is a lot of lectures that we get on democracy from the West, but India has stood its ground and India speaks about its strategic autonomy.
Exactly right. Now, I think Modi has been a transformative Prime Minister. I also think that he's liberated from those early post-independence hang-ups that I think some of the earlier Prime Ministers might have had. Modi doesn't look at a country like Australia and think white imperialists. He doesn't look at America and think those sorts of things. And I think he's prepared to work with other countries where he thinks India has common interests and common values. And I guess the point I'd make to India generally is that in the long run, I think it's overwhelmingly in India's best interests to make common cause with the democracies of the West, because we don't want to push India around. We have no territorial designs on India. Many of us have got large Indian diasporas who we're very proud of, and I just think there is a natural fit between India and the democratic world. And of course, I talk a lot about the Quad, and I know there's a bit of tension at the moment because of President Trump's punitive tariffs, and I can understand the resentment of that. But I do think that the Quad was the product of a very far-sighted Asian statesman in Shinzo Abe, who met a very decent and creative collaborator in Narendra Modi. And we all know why the Quad exists. It's to ensure that China does not get too belligerent, and the best way to ensure that Beijing, China under the CCP, does not get too belligerent is if there is a strong democratic partnership saying, look, there are certain red lines that you just can't cross.
Well, staying with China, 7 weeks ago, I was in Tianjin where the SCO summit was happening, and something very interesting happened. While many speak about the Galwan crisis between India and China, the kind of a reset that really both the countries want, and at the same time the tariffs, there was a huddle that happened between Modi, between Putin and Xi Jinping. And there were some kind of a nightmares, I wouldn't say nightmares, but perhaps some kind of huddle that happened in the White House. And Trump tweeted about it and said that we have lost India to China. How do you make a sense of that?
Well, I think sometimes, for all his many great strengths, the president is a bit impulsive. And I don't think that in any way has India gone across to the dark side. As I said, India is fundamentally committed to democracy and the rule of law. I think India is not going to allow itself to be bullied by anyone. I think that most Indians instinctively, whatever they think about oil purchases, most Indians are instinctively on the side of the gallant Ukrainians who are resisting a very, very aggressive dictator. I think that most Indians understand that China is constantly pushing forward against India's borders. China is bullying its own people, it's bullying its neighbours, and sure, there will be occasionally situations where countries like India have a common cause with China. I had a common cause with China when the Australian Armed Forces led the search for MH370 when it disappeared into the wastes of the southern Indian Ocean with about 150 Chinese nationals on board. So I was happy to work with the Chinese then, but I wasn't ever under any illusions about the nature of the Chinese regime. Even back then, when we were optimistic that China would liberalise, we were under no illusions that it was in fact a liberal regime. So look, by all means, Narendra should have moments of levity with other national leaders, even the national leaders of countries which he might not have much in common with, but I don't think it symbolises for a second any shift of India's basic position.
One question is also about the Middle East peace process, but I want to combine that with terrorism also. One is the Palestinian cause and their right to exist and the killings that have happened, but it began with the terrorist attack in southern Israel. Now, India has also been a victim of terrorism. You've seen the Pakistan-sponsored terror, earlier this year, Pahalgam terror attack, and then Operation Sindoor. How does the world tackle this? First. Second, is there a growing realization? Because often India goes out at the United Nations, at several multilateral forums, speaks about terrorism, speaks about a common definition that UN needs to arrive at. But that hasn't happened clearly in the last 30 years.
No. Well, look, I mean, these wanton attacks on innocent civilians are just diabolical. And I don't believe for a second that there is moral equivalence between terrorism and those that are resisting terrorism, or in the particular case that you mentioned first, there is no moral equivalence between Hamas, a death cult, an Islamist death cult, and the democratic government of Israel. Now, I'm not saying that the Israeli government never makes mistakes, but Israel is a decent country under the rule of law, which has been waging a just war of self-defense against Hamas, against Hezbollah, against the apocalyptic Islamists in Tehran. And I think that if there's one person above all else who can be credited with the release of the hostages, it's actually Bibi Netanyahu, whose implacable determination to damage all of Israel's existential foes has finally borne fruit. I think the key to the hostage release was when Israel attacked the Hamas representatives in Doha, because that indicated to Qatar, which has been the chief financial backer of Hamas, that the game was up. And if Hamas refuses to disarm, continues to terrorise the people of Gaza, well, I think it may well be time to hit Qatar again, because there can be no place for this death to the infidels mindset when it spawns the kind of terrorism that we have abundantly seen in recent years.
Well, I have to ask you one question on India-Australia ties. And of course, Modi has had a good relationship with no matter which Prime Minister has come to power there over the last 11 years, beginning with you. But, there are anti-immigration protests also that have been happening in Australia. Now, while there's a huge skilled force from India that's been working in Australia, there is people-to-people connect, there is a cultural bond, and there is trade. So how do you answer and try to convince the people out there of Indian diaspora that these attacks are not merely against you and these attacks will not affect? Because you would remember, many years back, there were these attacks. And now hundreds of people marching together, holding those banners, doesn't really send the right message.
I really would like to say to people of Indian background in Australia, and certainly to people here in India, I don't see those demonstrations as being in any way anti-Indian. I think they were representative of a feeling that immigration numbers generally are out of control in Australia, just as, at least until President Trump got re-elected, immigration across the Rio Grande was out of control, just as at the moment immigration across the English Channel, and indeed legal immigration into Britain, is out of control. Our problem in Australia is that we are an immigrant society, we are proudly an immigrant society, but just because you are an immigrant society doesn't mean that anyone from everywhere all the time should be coming. And we've really subcontracted out Australian residency to educational institutions, some of which are really selling residency as opposed to schooling, and to businesses which are bringing people in for short-term labour rather than training up and paying properly local people to do the job. So look, there is, I think, a bit of a surge of anti-immigration sentiment at the moment, but it's about the numbers. It's not about the individuals, and it certainly isn't directed against Indians. I mean, by and large, I would say that the Indians who've come to Australia have been model citizens. They've integrated well. They're very family focused. Most of them are in small business. They're all very keen to see their kids get the best possible education. So look, as far as I'm concerned, we're very lucky to have a large Indian diaspora.
Well, Prime Minister Abbott, I'm certain that if we have people like you who advocate India-Australia ties, then certainly they will go from strength to strength and scale up. Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure having you.
Thank you.
Thank you.